that somehow, lit a flame and began this fire. Like there were no excuses. Like there was no way this could have happened if God didn't do it. And again, this is important, and this is going to come back to the importance of generosity and specifically the purpose of generosity. But again, before we get to that, though, there's one more question. Like, again, there's that question of why the water, why the impractical that leads to the impossible. But there's another question in this story, and this is really kind of the question that really kind of captured my attention. And that is, where did they get the water? Where did they get the water? Have you ever thought that? Maybe it's just me. I get too much time on my hands, I guess, when I'm like this. But again, you got to remember, this is a drought. They haven't had water in 3 years. And where this is at, Mount Carmel, it was actually considered, it was believed it was actually like the home of Baal, which I think is really cool. Elijah's like, hey, not only am I going to take you on and show you that Yahweh is God Almighty, but listen, I'm going to take you on in your home turf, your home field. I'll give you every advantage you got. And but the truth is, though, Mount Carmel, more than it just being the kind of home of Baal, or considered to be the home of Baal, it was that it was this place was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was a long journey to get to any water. I mean, it was just a dust hill. There's not like there's a bunch of lakes or waters or rivers or anything like that around there. I mean, there was nothing there. And then on top of it, you got to look at the chronology of this. I mean, you got to look at the time scale of this. Is again, remember these prophets of Baal, from morning to the evening sacrifice. It says that they were ranting and raving and shouting from morning to evening. Yeah, now get this. When did Elijah start his, kind of challenge? When did Elijah, start to light the flame on the grill? Pretty much right at that same time, right at the evening sacrifice. So even if there was water down the hill, even a day's journey, there would not have been enough time for them to get down, to get the water, to bring it back. Now, I think the only way that they could have actually gotten the water to pour on the altar, to create this atmosphere, to create this stage for God to do the miraculous, was if this crowd that was around, is if they were willing to give up the water that they brought with them. Because again, to get to where Mount Carmel was, this was going to be like a day's journey for them. So safe to say that each one of them would have carried at least enough water for themselves. And so here you can just imagine Elijah's like, hey man, God's going to do the impossible. God's going to show you the reality of his greatness, the reality that he and he alone is God. But listen, he's calling you to do the impractical. And so listen, to do this, I'm going to need your water. And probably at first they're probably like, I don't know about that. like this is all I got. We're in a drought, this is a matter of life or death. I don't know if I can really surrender this. I don't know if I can give this over to you. And yet here's Elijah, and you just imagine Elijah, incredible guy of faith, just probably like, well, we'll just wait. I'll wait for as long as it takes until we start to get some water to do the impractical thing so God can do the impossible. And so I don't know what kind of transpired in there, but eventually, and just imagine one by one, they're pulling out. One guy's pulling out his Camelback, canteen. Other one's his little, I don't know, kind of yuppie, wooden style, canteen that he got in Portland. I don't know what the deal is, but they're slowly filling up all these jars with water, and then Elijah would take these 12 water pots and he would empty them on the ground once, twice, 3 times until all the ground got soaked. And I love it because it's this great picture. Again, what we're seeing here, what we're beginning to see is really a picture of generosity. What we're seeing here is a picture of how God not just does the impossible, but actually gets and pours his blessing onto our lives. See, God's avenue, God's mode of getting blessing, his blessing into our lives is through the transport of generosity. It's through the transport of giving what we got. Because listen, when you and I have the courage to give what we can, that's when God is able to do what we can't. And that's what we see here. We see this picture of this community, giving what they got. And as a result, God just pouring out his blessing, not just pouring fire, not just showing who he is, but ultimately, eventually pouring down rain, bringing more rain and bringing more water than they knew what they could do with or how they could handle. I mean, it just, this downpour. In fact, it made me kind of think of this story, this old preacher story, of a guy who, around 1930s, he was out walking in the middle of the desert and, came across this old pump. He was out of water and he was desperate, didn't think he was going to make it, but came across one of these old water pumps. I don't know if you've ever seen the water pumps, but the water pumps, back then, it's not like today where you just turn the faucet on and the water comes. Like you got to pump it, but more than pumping it, to get water, like you gotta pour a little bit of water in it to get it going. And in fact, actually, in this story, it actually says that as this traveler, he's making his way and he gets to this pump, that there was actually a note by this pump. And the note says, I've hidden a canteen under this rock in the shade, cork up, and I've put it in it just enough water to prime the pump. And as long as you drink it first, or as long as you don't drink it first, then it's going to work. Then it's going to get the pump going, right? Talk about a little bit of temptation here. So, I mean, again, here's this traveler. He's got this choice. He can hold on. He can hold on to what he's got in his hands, or he could pour it in the pump. He could trust in this author of this note, trust in the process of this pump, and by doing that, get more water, all the water that he needs. And again, I love that picture. I love that story and that illustration because, again, that's really what's going on here. Again, so often what this picture is, again, it's a sense of generosity that, listen, when you and I, we give what we can, God will do what we can't. And again, it seems super impractical, but it's generosity that's the mode and the transport of how he gets a blessing into our lives. And again, it doesn't always seem to make a lot of sense to us, and sometimes it can be a little bit frustrating for us. But that's how God really pours out his blessing. But again, it takes an incredibly impractical step to see God's impossible step happen in our lives. But here's where generosity kind of gets really confused for a lot of us. Is a lot of us stop with that. See, I think a lot of us, we actually kind of get that. We get that, okay, yes, if I give, if I give what I can, when it comes to my time, when it comes to, maybe a tithe, and when I say tithe, that 10%, when I obediently give and I surrender that to God, yes, God will bless. God will pour out his blessings. We get caught up in the promise, but a lot of us, we kind of get that. We get the promise of the process, right? But what I think sometimes we get confused is we mistake the promise of the process, his process of getting blessing to us through generosity, as the purpose of the process. See, the promise of the process is that, listen, the well will work. When you give what's in your canteen, he will pour down the blessings of heaven upon you. He will. The promise is that when you trust God, when you trust in the source rather than just your resource, and you really surrender it to God, God is going to provide. My wife and I are, I think, a real testament to that. Ever since we've been married, we've always given. We've always been faithful in terms of tithing to God. And I'm not going to sit there and say that we've always had, just, more than enough, or times where like, just, an abundance of stuff. But listen, we've never gone hungry. We've never gone without. God has always provided for us. The promise of the process has always held true in our life. And listen, anyone here who has walked in generosity, has given and really walked in that practice of giving faithfully, you can recognize that. You understand that. You get the promise of the process. But again, where we get off is when we mistake the promise for the purpose of the process. See, don't mistake this. The promise and the purpose of the process are two very different things. The promise is that, yes, you generosity, when you give what you can, God will do what we can't. But the purpose is so much more than that. The purpose is to actually see God maybe in a way that we've never seen him before. The purpose of God is to actually see God ultimately for who he really is in our lives. In fact, some of you are like, I don't know if I really get this. Well, follow with me here. Malachi chapter 3, verse 10 really speaks this. In fact, actually sets up a very similar test, kind of like what we see the prophets Baal versus Elijah. This kind of challenge here. It's speaking in terms of tithes and offerings. And we see in Malachi 3:10 it says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, and there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. I like that part where it says, see if. See the whole point of this. The whole point of this, and again, this is where it can get really frustrating. This is when we just buy into the idea of the process and mistake the promise for the purpose. One of the big things we can mistake is we can fail to see the ultimate goal here, the real purpose of it. And the real purpose is to see God simply for who he is. And listen, you'll never really see God for who he is as our provider, as our source, as the one we can trust in if you never walk down this path of generosity. You never will. That's the reality. That's what's going on here, is to get you to see. And again, why I say this can be a frustration for a lot of us is because I think sometimes in generosity, especially when we hear about giving, especially when it comes to giving of not just time but money and resources, there can be a lot of guilt kind of involved in it. Some of us, we might feel a little bit of shame, and some of it, is I think something just kind of poor teaching through the church. Sometimes we kind of have kind of taken this passage and almost kind of taken it out of context, kind of used it to beat people over the head. But you got to understand something. Again, the purpose. The purpose, again, is to see God for who he is. In other words, when it comes to generosity, when it comes to giving, listen, you've got to know God's not looking for us to prove something to him, but that he wants to prove something to us. He's not looking for us to prove something to him, but that he wants to prove something to us. Notice in that verse in Malachi 3, it says, test me in this. Notice he's not saying, hey, test yourself. He's saying, test me in this. This is about me showing and proving to you that I am someone you can trust in. I am the only one you can really rest your life in and cannonball into and rest your security, rest your trust and provision and faith for the future in. Trusting, and not in your resources, but trusting in these sources. See, this is not about you proving something to me. And in fact, I can tell you this is the truth, because when you really look at the context of this passage, so often we fail to sort of read the passages right before this. And Malachi 3:7 speaks to this very thing. It says, I, the Lord, do not change, so you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. What's he getting at here? He's speaking of something really significant that you got to get. If you're ever going to really walk in generosity, is understanding that when it comes to God's affection for you, when it comes to God's love for you, it's not based on sort of a pay-to-play thing. He's not looking for you to somehow prove yourself to him. Like if I give enough or give so often that somehow God's love is going to be affected by that. Somehow his heart is going to be affected by that. Truth is, when it comes to his love for you is unconditional. His love for you never changes. Listen, there's nothing you can do to make God love you any more or any less than he does right now. And yeah, while it's true our giving can reveal our heart towards him, it's not reflected in his heart towards us. That's why I say, people will be like, man, do I have to give? No, you don't have to give. When it comes to, God's heart for you, if your motive in giving is in relation to somehow trying to appease God or somehow win his approval, listen, you don't have to give. In fact, that should never be the motive to give, because your giving has no influence on his heart towards you. His love for you is unconditional. But I've shared this before, though, too, is that when it comes to his blessings, there are some blessings that are conditional. There are some blessings that are conditional. Listen, again, if you want to experience God's blessing in your life, the only way to experience it is through this avenue of generosity. You giving what you can so God can do what you can't. And listen, some of you might get pushback. Well, wait a second, though. What about the next verse? Because this is the verse that we love to sort of guilt people on, and like, man, you got to give, you got to prove your commitment, you got to prove your heart for God, and we see this in sort of the next verse, but again, I think as we're going to come to discover, is sometimes we can tend to kind of take that a little bit out of context. As it says, ever since, verse 7 says, ever since the time of your ancestors, you've turned away from my decrees and have not kept them. Return to me and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty. But you ask, how are we to return? Which, by the way, I love that because, again, it reminds us that giving is not so much about getting, it's all about getting closer to God. It's all about a relationship. It's about drawing, getting closer in a relationship, seeing God for who he really is in our lives. And it goes on, it says, will a mere mortal rob God, yet you rob me? But you ask, how are we robbing you? And here we go. In tithes and offerings, you are under a curse, your whole nation, because you're robbing me. Now, again, this is the part where, again, if you grew up in a church like I grew up in, this is the part where the guilt and the shame tends to come in, right? And typically it was done in a Tebian voice, like, how are you robbing me? Robbing me with the tithes and offerings. They get all worked up, get the handkerchief out, right? But again, really, again, when we feel that, when we feel that guilt and shame, you need to know that's not from God. Again, this is not about you proving something to God, proving your commitment to him. It's about a God who's trying to prove the reality of his heart and his desire and his plans for you. Because, again, what we miss in this is that actually really what it's speaking to, it's connecting to the actual curse. Notice it says you're under a curse. It's not saying that, listen, you don't give. I'm going to make you pay. I'm going to put a curse under you or on you. It's saying you're under a curse. There's already a curse. It's speaking of the curse. And in fact, it's actually alluding to really the very first picture we see of tithing in Genesis chapter 3. And when we see it in the very garden itself, when God sat there and said, hey, listen, you can eat from all the trees of the fruit, but this one tree, this little bit, listen, I've reserved this for me. And yet, when they made a choice to not protect that, not to honor that they found themselves under a curse. And so when God's speaking this, he's sitting there, he's speaking to the fact that listen, and of course, the result of that curse was especially when it comes to finances, when it comes to our lives, is that so much more work than we were created to ever really have to go through. And so, you can almost see it when God's speaking this, it's not a place of condemnation. This isn't a place of, it's not coming from a heart of listen, you're going to pay if you don't give. No, it's in there saying, listen, because of sin, because of what we find, from all the way back in the garden when sin entered the world, you're under a curse. But listen, I've got more for you than that. When he's talking about robbing, you rob me from tithes and offerings, it's not like he needs your tithes and offerings. It's not like he's looking for something from you. It's not like man, it's like the Bible says that there's no, night in heaven, So it's not like God's like sitting there going, man, it costs a lot to keep all the lights on in here. I don't know if we're going to be able to afford the light bill. Really could use some tithes and offerings. And when you don't give, you're robbing from me. You're stealing from me. No. What he's getting at is when we don't give, when we don't surrender, when we don't have that opportunity or when we don't take that step to walk and live out this generous lifestyle, sitting there saying, God, I'm going to surrender my resource. I'm going to surrender that 10%. I'm going to surrender my time. I want to be used by you. When we don't cannonball into this thing, this isn't that God is going to somehow come down on you or somehow looks down on you. It's what he's getting at is no, what you're doing is when you do that, you're robbing me from an opportunity to bless you. See, God's heart is he wants to bless you. God's desire is he has good plans and good purposes in store for you. Do you have to give? Do you have to live generous? No, you don't have to. Is God going to love you any less? No. But I tell you what, if you want to experience God's blessing, you want to, see God kind of make a wave and leave a ripple effect, not just in your life, but in the lives around you. Listen, the only way is through this path of generosity. When you have the courage to give what you can, I'm telling you, God will do what you can't. But even more than that, you'll see God for who he really is. I'm telling you, when I've given, and especially when I've given not just a tithe, but given an offering. An offering, the difference is, tithe is your first 10%. An offering is sort of above and beyond. An offering, in some ways, is really kind of what the Israelites were doing in this battle in 1 Kings 18. I mean, it's something that a true offering, it should make you gulp a little bit. It should make you sweat a little bit. And yet again, when we do that, when we take that step, when we ask God, what is it you want me to give? How do you want me to give? When we take that step and we're obedient to that, it's amazing how God shows up and shows himself real and shows himself who he really is in a way that I can tell you, you will never see without that walking that path of generosity. And so I want to pray for you guys tonight. And really that's, it's really kind of my heart is again, this is all about cannonballing. It's all about how can I, surrender my life, give all that I got to God in such a way that it leaves a ripple effect. And listen, one of the ways, you want to see God not just work in your life and through your life in powerful ways. Listen,